I'm a PI, not a homewrecker. And I don't think your husband, in his line of business, would want a better dick anyhow. I awoke in my desk chair. Across from me were his piercing amber eyes. They surprised me at first, but I should have known he'd be there. I stretched and said mid-yawn, "Not very nice to sneak into a sleeping woman's apartment," but his stare just continued. I laughed at his glare. I'd seen San Francisco's shrewd thugs, hardened cops, and deadly politicians, but none could ever match that gaze. I knew I didn't have what he wanted. Reaching into my coat, I took out my knife and flicked it open. I held the knife steady while staring back at him. "Look," I said, nodding towards the desk. "That's all there is. Take it or leave it." But a detective knows when she's beat, and I knew then. He wanted to search the place, and that's what he would do. I sighed, knowing my weakness for his type. "All right," I said. "Let's look." He let out a gleeful meow in victory. I cut a piece of my apple that the cat had rejected. "Always the sore winner," I jabbed. But I was smiling too, because I was telling the truth. There was absolutely no other food in my apartment. The cat often dropped by to scavenge. He made a lot of noise when he thought I was holding out on him. But right now, the place was clean empty. No food anywhere. I had to prove it to him. The cat had waltzed into my apartment a few years earlier. He kept coming back, though there was rarely a morsel to eat. He'd continue his loud meowing until I proved him He'd continue his loud meowing until I proved to him the place was empty of food. Let's talk to the cat. "It doesn't matter how doe-eyed you are, cutie pie. I've got no food around," I told him. He licked his chops and looked at me. Apparently he still didn't believe that. I needed to contradict him somehow, to show him something in the apartment that would prove it was empty of food. I went back to the apartment to search for clues that I could show to him. A newspaper was flopped on the floor, its headline about the death of Lenin, leader of the Red Menace sweeping Russia. It seemed the Bolsheviks had lost their head. My old notebook, now filled to the brim, I wrote everything down, even the minor details. Never know what can be useful. The first half had my old cases, details from the beats I used to walk in my policewoman days. Of course, policewomen were forbidden from going on patrol, but Lewis often overlooked that rule. That lamp had belonged to my Uncle Lewis. He'd been an SFPD officer, one who argued policewomen should be good detectives, even while the others jeered at me. I knew he'd been right, but my current workload didn't help that claim. I thought about Lewis more often than I wanted. I was lousy at handling the emotions behind those thoughts. Packaged cigarettes were the latest trends, but I still preferred to roll my own. The ashtray was evidence that it was a practiced skill. I suppose I had a lot of free time back then. I kept a small statue underneath the side table. It had been police evidence in a crime, and its owner hadn't wanted it back. I took a shine to it, so I snagged it for myself on my way out of the department. I had taken copies of old murder cases from the SFPD records when I'd left. I loved reading through them, even though my own contributions were minimal. At the time, I longed for those type of jobs. The truth was, any work was hard to find for a female detective. The regular white icebox, tinged yellow with age, half blocked the kitchen doorway. My income rarely kept much stocked in it, and right now it was empty. the door to the outside world. If I left now, though, the cat would start wailing so loud I'd get complaints from the neighbours. No, he needed convincing before I could leave. Okay, so there's a list of evidence. The regular white icebox tin. Yeah, okay. I opened the icebox so the cat could see inside. Empty, I told him. The cat looked quizzically at the open door, then back at me. Sorry, fella. There's no grub in there for me either. He stared at me with eyes as disappointed as I felt. Those big yellows always got to my soul. Thoughts of my family filled my head. My sister Muriel had sent me a letter with an update of her life in Chicago. She and her husband had just purchased a new home outside the bluster of the city. Their 3 young children were looking forward to the move. I'd never told Muriel, but those letters kept me going. Hearing about my family, however remote, helped me cope with the isolation I was feeling. I'd refused to accept it myself back then, but perhaps Muriel had known anyway. My sister had the ordinary lifestyle that I had rejected. I'd wanted to change the world, to bring justice for victims, especially the ones that no longer had a voice. Not that I was helping advance that cause with the type of cases coming my way. My mind spiraled into the usual series of questions. Had I even impacted the women's movement? Had I made any change on society at all? Was my plodding career worth losing traditional happiness? What was the point in the life I had chosen? A loud meow from the cat snapped my thoughts back into the moment. I took a deep breath and grinned back at him. Guess you can scram now, I said. Nobody's going to come knocking with food for you, fella. There immediately came a banging on the front door. Beyond a nuisance, this cat was psychic too. You water out? I asked him. Okay, let's open the door. In the doorway was the regrettably familiar face of Connor Green. His company churned my stomach. It might have been his bergamot perfume, which hung around my nostrils like a lingering, unwanted guest, or that sordid smile, which was forever plastered on his face. He stared at me through the doorway with a coy smile. Well, ain't you gonna invite me inside? I started closing the door, but he stuck out his foot to stop me. Hey now, he chided. Foul way to treat a customer, Malone. So that was his angle, hiring me as a detective. I wondered what a bootlegger would need with a private eye, but he answered without my prompt. I'll make this quick. I can't take this to the Hog House or the pigs would laugh me out. Another dick's just known as tempting. His grin widened. Thought this was going to be quick, I said, and I started rolling a cigarette. It wasn't quick, and I'd already rolled and lighted a second smoke when Green finally finished his story. I noted the important bits in my book. It had started with a letter slipped under his door in a white envelope. The envelope contained a single typewritten leaf which he handed to me. It read, "End your game or we'll end you." It had no signature. Instead, ending with only a small scribble in the bottom right corner that resembled a black hand. Green had a lead on a new rum running scheme, a connection from Vancouver. He'd given a sample to Tiny Paul, the gangster who ran the Tin Spoon speakeasy for mob bosses Jerry Ferry. They'd agreed to buy in for more. Green surmised the letter was about his rum running. He suspected Redstone's stable, another bootlegger, of sending the letter. He told me that stable ran a barber shop during the day and gave me the address. Green needed to know who the threat was from. He'd get Paul's gang to deal with them and continue his scheme to get rich. If I go snooping myself, he concluded, folks see I'm not as trusting people. No trust leads to no customers. I need to play it low-key, which is where you come in. I raised an eyebrow and stared at him through the cigarette smoke. Something in his yarn was still twisted. He must have noticed my reticence, because he said, You know, I work closely with Lewis. I'm sure he'd want to protect me as much as any other victim. My uncle. I was still searching for answers after his death. He'd been a man obsessed with helping victims and bringing justice to those beyond salvation. With that ethos, I'd never understood how he could have taken his own life. Those thoughts haunted me. I'd quit the SFPD and started my own practice, taking his philosophy. Was Green worth my time? Would he be worth Lewis's? Green had tipped off my uncle in a few cases. I wondered if that was enough to warrant my protection. Before I could think past my headache, he threw a bill in my lap. Keep the C note as a retainer. Don't worry about getting in touch. I'll find you later for a chat. He turned down the hallway, and I let him go. If he was willing to give me $100 with no commitment, I wouldn't stop him. I turned back to the apartment, still confused about the whole story. My headache wasn't helping either. Whenever I lacked clarity, a trip to Southern Coffee was usually the cure. Okay, so I guess we're going out the door. I'd mounted a gold plate on the outside that read P.C. Malone, Private Investigator. Okay, let's leave! There was only one place I needed to go clear my head. Southern Coffee was a basement dive. It wasn't modern, hip, or ever busy. And it was my favourite place to down some paint, especially in the company of the best bartender in the city. I hailed a driver, gave him the address, and stopped through the back door. I debated talking with the driver. Yeah, let's talk to the driver, why not? We began idle chatter, but the driver kept stifling laughter. When I asked him why, he apologised and said, Just got out of Felix the Cat Show and they're running all of them out back of the Orpheum. Best storm I've spent. We talked about Felix the Cat collection, including his favourite, Felix in Hollywood. Can you believe they got Charlie Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks in a cartoon? We came to my destination and he was still laughing. I stepped out of the taxi cab with a smile on my face. Southern Coffee was an automat diner. Ethel Burgess, the lone waitress, was friendly to help with any inquiry. Of course, if you winked at her right, she'd show you the way to the downstairs toilet, where Frankie paid bathroom attendant. Southern Coffee had the distinct feeling of home. The familiar smell of mold in that old basement was enough to put a grin on my face. Okay, what have we got to click on here? Frankie had a bond with that old shaker at the end of the bar. I was surprised he hadn't named it. He could sling a mean drink, though he'd only use the good liquor if he liked you. Frankie liked me. The bar stools were crooked and worn. My usual one was in the centre of the room. I could sit in it for hours if Frankie had a yarn to spin. Of course, the sauce helped keep me in place too. Once I'd asked Frankie to lend me some cash from that register. He'd growled so fierce that I decided not to ask again. I didn't think his employers would notice before I got it back, but maybe he just wanted to save me from myself. The worn stairs led to the outside world. No, I don't want to leave. Frankie kept a collection of pre-prohibition bottles on a shelf behind the counter. Their shapes and colours were far more alluring than the opaque jugs of modern swill. This label showed a rearing horse in front of a forest. I had no idea how the horse related to California's most genuine bourbon whiskey, though I suppose I did stare at the picture long enough to whet my appetite for a bottle's contents. I grabbed the wine bottle on the bar and examined its label. It featured a picture of grapes and the words sacramental use only. Frankie looked at me with a spark in his eye. "Go ahead," he said. "Give the swig." Well, okay. I grabbed the half-empty glass that had been next to the bottle and swirled some of its contents between my gums. "Bit spicy, ain't it?" Frankie asked. "It's good," I nodded, and gulped the rest down. "It'll cost you too," he said with a smile, and grabbed the bottle from me, turning it through his hands. "Rabbis charge more than a nickel for this beauty. Only this type of Napa wine is made from that Zinfandel grape. It has a unique aroma." I'd been trying to learn more about wine. Seemed everyone knew their stuff but me. I noted what Frankie had said about the origin of the grape as he sat the bottle back at the bar. "Since when do you know grapes?" I chided. Frankie let out a belly laugh. "Some of these grapes are older than you, Malone, and I've known about them since I was a small tot. That's why I'm so good at my job, you know." Frankie sighed. "Too bad more folks can't taste them. That woman's league is the devil." The Women's Christian Temperance Union was now under feminine Frances Willard, a positive force for the suffrage of women, but her staunch support of prohibition, along with the union's massive political clout, irked the very wet San Franciscan public, and she particularly wasn't popular with bartenders. "Take a seat," he said. "I'll make you something else." He was a big fella, both wide and tall. Must have been a little over 50. He had a round head, kind brown eyes, and a cropped ring of grey hair encircling an otherwise bald scalp. His voice had a warm timbre that complemented the tobacco and whiskey smells of his speakeasy. I sat at the bar. "You got the spooks, PC?" he asked. "You're worn as a catcher's mitt." I suppose my exhaustion showed. "I won $100 for nothing and I can't let it go." I told Frankie about the case, the threatening letter sent to Connor Green, how he assumed it was related to his bootlegging and his suspicion of Redstone Stable. The story took longer than I'd wanted, Frankie showing genuine interest by asking many questions. When I finished, he threw me the whiskey sour he'd been stirring. I took a large gulp and gave a sigh as thanks. "Well, Green's case is better than most of what you're given," he said with some enthusiasm. "Least it's not more of that adultery bunk." "Sure," I replied, but I started with a goal in mind. What's the point in helping a man like Green? Frankie clicked his tongue on his teeth. "Lawyer or priest? Why does it matter? Let me ask you, are the clients you have now the types you want to help?" I admitted they weren't. I told him I'd wanted more from my detecting life. "It could be that Green's case shoots your career forward, Malone." I sighed and stared down at my drink. But my daze was interrupted by the basement door opening, then slamming shut. A small, blustering woman began marching towards me. She looked younger than 25 and was a few inches shorter than my 5'6". I thought her grey trench coat was too large for that small frame, which was when I realised it was exactly like the one that had belonged to Lewis. She hurled insults at me a while. All I could do was sit and take it until she ran out of gas and started breathing heavily. I set my drink on the bar and looked her in the eyes. I studied her features more thoroughly. It was plain she was a knockout, now that she'd finished shrieking. Beyond the latest blush and lipstick, She had the natural soft skin and bright eyes perpetually desired by the opposite sex. While I was eyeing her, she caught her breath and restarted her tirade. "I'm the wife of that bum who sneaks into your bed." I asked, "The cat?" But humour wasn't her angle, and she launched into another poetic stanza. "And he just left your sty this morning," she finally ended. And that is when I gathered she was Connor Green's wife. "Mrs. Green, I'm a PI, not a homewrecker, and I don't think your husband, in his line of business, would want a better dick anyhow." Her look was pure incredulity. "A woman in that line of work?" she questioned. "I don't believe it." Okay, do I have any... I could show her the notebook. I opened my notebook and flipped through its pages. "You see, Mrs. Green, this is what I can do. There's not much more I can show you to prove it." It still took more coaxing for her to believe me, but eventually she came around. She seemed grateful I'd explained it to her. Apparently, she had seen her husband leave my apartment, and distraught, she had followed me all the way to Frankie's basement and decided to confront me. "I suppose I lost my head after what I thought I'd seen," she said, and she began to cry. Frankie, ever chivalrous to a dimpled girl, came around the bar and held her up. "Now that's all right, Mrs. Green. Why don't I hail your cab and send you back home?" She agreed, and they walked together up the stairs. When Frankie returned, I said to him, "You turned tonight real quick." He snorted a laugh. "Oh, hell, we can't have that siren in here. With a torture yelling like that, every street bugger would have come to her rescue." "Mrs. Green is a torch singer." "Well, I learned she was Mrs. Connor Green just now, when she came in here. I'd only seen her as Lil Fanny singing lead for the jazz band at the Tin Spoon." "The Tin Spoon?" I said. "Tiny Paul's joint. That's where Green is selling his liquor." "Say, you think that's where she met her husband?" I laughed. "You're the real sleuth, Frankie." He made a sarcastic bow. I shook my head. "You're telling me you escorted our little torture out just to avoid a bit of hot water?" Frankie flushed and said, "What are you talking about, Malone?" I was never good with emotions, but it was plain that Frankie had instantly fallen for the girl. "So what if I had more to squeeze out of her?" I asked. "What more could you possibly want from little Fanny? She can't have anything to do with Green's mess." I considered Frankie's point. Maybe she was unrelated to this case. I shrugged and stood up from the bar stool. I looked at Frankie. "What's eating you, kid?" he asked. I pointed to the shaker on the bar. "Mind mixing me a drink?" I said to Frankie. "What'll you have?" he replied with a smile. I asked for a gin, Ricky." Frankie twirled a bottle of gin and another of seltzer, poured them equally into a highball, then squeezed half a lime into the mixture. I drank slowly. We had a pleasant conversation. But I forget what about. When I'd finished the drink, Frankie asked if I had everything else I wanted to talk about. "Those bottles behind the counter make this place come together," I told Frankie. He nodded agreement. "Just a shame they don't make them like that after Prohibition." "You can always become a glass blower," I offered. Frankie laughed. "I like to save my breath for talking. Something else on your minds?" "Never mind," I said, and I swiveled my seat away from the bar. What had just happened was quite the ruckus. It seemed like my cue to move along. I was heading up the stairs when Frankie called after me. So, what are you going to do? I'd been thinking about my sister and that letter she had written to me. In some ways, her life sounded appealing, but I knew it would never be satisfied with it. I steeled myself. I guess I'll take Connor Green's bait, I replied. I've got nothing better on the stove, and he might need the help. Something still stinks, though. Well, what's your plan? Frankie asked. The way I see it, I have 3 goals right now. Green hired me for a job. Find the guy who wrote the letter. That's the basic part. But you want more? Asked Frankie. I nodded. Green's a shady character. I have to learn about him. Who is this guy? Dig in his past. I can't go back to him blind. And then there's something about his bootlegging. How'd Green get a connection like that? What's his source exactly? Squeezing that lemon might get me more juice. That sounds alright, he replied. So where is it you're off to? I've got 3 leads. That bootlegger stable, who Green claims sent him the letter, the Tin Spoon Lounge, where I might learn more about Green's rum running schemes, and Mrs. Green, who could give me more dirt on her husband. Frankie nodded his approval. Well, if you're ever stuck, come back and see me. You can never solve anything without talking it over. I smiled and went up the stairs. Dumb things on street. So many dumb things on street. Dumb